Very warm welcome to this iteration of our Global Talks series. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Juan Francisco Chavez today to present. Before I do this, however, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen speaking people on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands. And, you know, the Songhees, Esquam, and Wasanish peoples whose historic relationship with this land continues to this day. And although that will not be Juan Francisco's direct emphasis, I suppose that today's topic, the issue of mining and oil pipelines and the extractive industry, speaks again to the ownership and stewardship over land. And in this respect, it's even more important to underline the unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples here on what is now known as Victoria or Vancouver Island. Well, let me introduce Juan Francisco, who is currently a fellow from the business school where he now pursues his degree at the Gustafson School of Business here at UVic. And as a true global citizen, Juan Francisco has a multitude of experience coming first from receiving a BA in anthropology from Peru in 2006, and then he continued on his educational career, going to the Erasmus Rotterdam University and there where he received an MA in Development Studies in 2011. And as we will hear soon, Juan Francisco's interest is at this intersection of business policy, strategy, management, and the broader field of sustainability. And in particular, his focus of a thesis is on oil pipelines and the politics of oil and how the complex issues that arise from this field of business is being addressed in debates, in practices in his field. So you can tell the particular focus that Juan Francisco takes also is informed by his prior professional experiences where he has worked in different organizations and businesses in a consultancy capacity and trying to bring together different stakeholders and try to find appropriate ways of addressing the complex issues that arise with the business of oil pipelines. This is, Juan Francisco told me before, the first opportunity for him to present on this topic. And so all the more I'm thankful for him to step up to the plate and share with us his insight and his approaches. And I'm sure he is, will be thankful for some of us also after the event, getting back to him if you have any insight, any suggestions in this respect. So, Juan Francisco, the floor is all yours. I understand you are at the center. We almost feel nostalgic now looking at your office. Could I invite you to come on and start your presentation?
Perfect. Thank you, Oliver, for those kind words. And thank everyone at the center for being so welcoming and supportive in these weird times, in this pandemic time. So I'm very grateful of being part of the center. And thanks everyone for joining me today, for your interest in this project. So first, I want to apologize because I feel that on the title and the description that I shared of this project, there was a lot of jargon. Kind of like the official title of this paper is a configurational approach to the effectiveness of organizational responses to legitimacy threats in plural and complex institutional environments. But if I have to kind of like change the title into something with a little bit less jargon, it would be like the effectiveness of business responses to controversies, lessons from the Canadian oil pipeline industry. And I think it's important to mention that, so this is the first paper of a set of 3 that are part of my dissertation project. This is still a work in progress, of course. So any feedback, comments, suggestions would be kind of like much appreciated. And I also want to recognize that even though this is part of my dissertation, this is also like, we don't do these projects alone, right? So I have to thank a lot my supervisor, Professor Matt Murphy, and Also, Belaid Moa, who is a professor in the Faculty of Computer Engineering, who has been amazing in helping me with some specific parts of the methods that I'm using for this project. So I have to give them credit as well. Everything that you see as a weakness or something bad with this project is me to blame. Everything that is amazing is kind of like probably more a collaborative effort from multiple minds. So, okay, let's get started. So my goal today is to, first I want to share my research kind of like more as a journey. So I want to tell you a little bit how I approach this data and approach this issue of pipeline projects here in Canada. Kind of like as a journey, right? And kind of like the different decisions that I have been making in the way. Something that is important, this is a work in progress. So what I'm going to share today is not finished. So I have some preliminary results, but I still need to do some additional work in the interpretation and theorization of my results. So feedback would be much appreciated. I would like to hear whether the story makes sense to you. What do you think are the weaknesses? What else can I do to kind of like improve the project, and where can I go from here, right? What kind of like avenues for future research I can kind of like maybe try to pursue in the future. So with that being said, a little bit of my background, because I think it's important for you to know like what's my own position in this research, like how am I approaching this, my cases and my data. So I was trained as a social scientist. I'm more a qualitative researcher. Kind of like throughout my experience, I have usually looked into kind of like how do people construct meaning and how do culture and values influence decision-making processes. My work experience, as Oliver mentioned, has been usually related to extractive industries. And what I have found really interesting as a social scientist when looking into this industry is that the amount of controversies and conflict, right? And this is kind of like closely linked to the idea of culture and values. Usually we can see conflict and controversies arising when there's clash between different value systems and norms and beliefs, right? And I think that it is based on this experience and interest, I find that it's really important to reflect upon the value criteria that inform decision-making processes, that inform our notions of what is considered to be legitimate or not, and also what are the values that inform our ideas of what is the public interest. And this is all for the sake of fairness and social justice. So I really think that we cannot believe that we live in a fair and just society if we are not accounting for the diversity of value systems that exist or coexist in society, right? And all these kind of like background and motivation, I think, informs what is my research interest, in particular with this project, which is to understand how strategic and institutional processes unfold in plural and complex institutional environments. So, so that's kind of like a little bit my background, my positioning. Probably this will help you to think of, I don't know, what can be other things that I can do with my data that also like fits with what are kind of like my interests and background. Okay, so let's now talk about this particular study. So I have in this slide kind of like a quick overview of the whole project, right? So my research question for this study is what explains the different degrees of effectiveness of organizational responses to institutional plurality and complexity. Now, when I talk about organizational responses, usually when we are in the business school, it's a given that when we talk about organizational responses, we're talking about the responses from business organizations, right? In this particular study, I'm talking about the responses of the companies that apply for permits to get their pipeline projects approved, right? So when I talk about organizational responses, I'm talking about from the perspective of the applicants, those that apply for permits for these particular pipelines. My context is oil pipeline industry in Canada. So I'm not looking into gas pipelines. I'm specifically focusing on oil pipeline projects. I have my cases, I have 35 cases. Each of them is from a different oil pipeline project. And in particular, my cases are, I would say, the hearings where these projects are being reviewed and assessed by the National Energy Board, which is the regulatory agency in Canada that reviews and approves pipelines, right? The data that I have is the verbatim transcripts of public hearings held as part of the review process of these oil pipeline projects. I have projects from 1993 to 2018. My key concepts, so you're going to be hearing a lot of these kind of like terms of institutional plurality, institutional complexity. I'll be talking about stakeholders, legitimacy, effectiveness, and also frames and framing and value-based frames. So those are kind of like some of the words that you're going to be hearing a lot throughout my presentation. And kind of like one underlying argument in this study is that the effectiveness of organizational responses is contingent on the characteristics of the institutional environment. So one particular action, tactic, or strategy can be effective in a particular setting, but of course, that doesn't mean that will be as effective in other contexts where are characterized with having more, being more plural or more complex, right? So that's kind of like the relationship that is being explored here. My focus is on language. So when we talk about organizational responses being more or less effective, we can also argue that power of the stakeholders involved in the controversy played a very important role. But here I'm specifically looking at language. So I'm not measuring power, I'm not measuring control of resources. I'm very specifically looking at language. And I'm using a combination of methods. So I'm using topic modeling, which some people would consider as an automated form of doing content analysis. I'm doing old school content analysis in a non-automated way. And finally, I'm using a fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis in the last stage of my project. So this is kind of like a quick overview. This slide is horrible, so I just wanted to show you the list of the projects that are in my data set. And I have highlighted those that are probably the most popular ones. So we have in my data set, we have a Trans Mountain Expansion Project, we have a Northern Gateway Project, we have Keystone, XL Pipeline, and we have also Line 3 Replacement Program. So these are kind of like very popular and well-known projects, pipeline projects, and we have many others that are probably not as famous as these 4 or 5 that I have already mentioned, but that are also part of my data set. From now on, I'll just use the acronyms of these projects, but we have this table to go back if there's any specific question about a particular project. And what we can see here also the years of these projects, so they span from 1993 to 2018. Okay, so I would like to talk now about the context. And that speaks also about the relevance of the study, and I would say also about the motivation of the study, right? So first, when we talk about the oil pipeline industry in Canada, we know that it's considered by many actors as being of significant importance for the Canadian economy in terms of the kind of like percentage of the GDP, the money it represents in terms of revenues and taxes, and the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are being created by the industry, right? The figures of indirect jobs is always a tricky one, but we could agree that there are jobs that are being created by the industry, right? For sure. We also see that through kind of like in the last couple of decades, we've seen many changes in the regulatory framework that probably are not directly linked to the oil industry, but definitely affects how pipeline projects are being reviewed and assessed, right? So we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we have Bill 669 approved in 2019. Internationally, we have UNDRIP, we have Paris Agreement, etc. And overall, we see that pipeline project has become highly controversial in Canada, right? So we could be for or against pipelines, but we have to agree that different positions coexist in regard to pipeline projects. And here we have a quick timeline. So I have my first project in my data set is from 1993, and then the last one is from 2018. And we see here some regulatory changes and court cases that definitely influence how actors mobilize different framings in these hearings, the hearings that I'm analyzing. So all these cases, all these regulatory frameworks and different events have been mentioned by stakeholders that participate in the hearing. So some of them talk about these court cases of Bergamoy and British Columbia, Haida Nation versus British Columbia. They talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They talk about UNDRIP, DRIPA, and other kind of like court cases related to oil oil pipeline projects. So this kind of like gives us an overview of all the things that have happened in this time frame of 25, 26 years. That is that I'm 25, 26 years where most of my projects can be located. And and something that was really interesting. So I collected this data in 2018. So I got the hearing transcripts of these. Initially was 39 projects, then I reduced my sample to 35. And something that happened the year after was the Bill 669 that declared the demise of the NEB. And then the NEB kind of like died, and then the CER got created, the Canadian Energy Regulator. And this is kind of like also like really interesting because the demise of the NEB also speaks for how controversial the industry became in the last couple of years, how contested were pipeline projects, and also the criteria and the way the NEB was reviewing and approving these projects. So this is kind of like also a very interesting process of the deinstitutionalization of the NEB, right? As an institution that is responsible for reviewing and approving the pipelines based on the notion of the public interest. So a lot of criticism against the NEB was based on how the NEB was interpreting the notion of the public interest. So we see a lot of the actors and stakeholders that participate in the hearings are contesting and trying to reshape and provide meaning to what the public interest is or should be. Okay, so that's I find that is one of the most interesting things of these cases and this data set. So when the Bill 69 was approved, of course, there were some groups that were saying Bill 69 is not enough. Others were saying it's just too much, right? But again, this is also an expression of how controversial is this issue in Canadian politics, right? So let's, now if we start investigating more detail what is going on regarding how pipeline projects are being reviewed, evaluated, and approved, and why are they so controversial, we must look at the NEB and the review process, right? Which comprises the public hearings from which I'm drawing my main data set. So what is the NEB? It's a regulatory agency at the federal level that reviews major pipeline projects. What is its mandate is to decide whether pipeline projects should be approved based on the public interest. And this is what makes these cases like really interesting, right? So very broadly, the public interest refers to the welfare or well-being of the general public, okay, and society as a whole, right? Now, in regulation, the concept or the idea of the term, the notion of public interest is vaguely defined. But based on some of the guidelines by the NEB, we know that it entails balancing multiple interests at multiple levels, right? And not only that, we're talking about interests that are themselves dynamic, so they change in time. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that the notion of public interest is vaguely defined, but probably what is problematic is that, for example, a lot of the criticism against the NEB is that they have a lot of discretion in their interpretation of the public interest. And oftentimes the criticism is saying that there seems to be just a very narrow set of values that inform their decision of what the public interest is, which is mainly economic value, right? So because it is very broad and vague, there has been, and there's a lot of room for interpretation, many actors, and a lot of discretion given to the NEB has been kind of like one of the key issues that the NEB has been criticized about. So the problem is, because of this problem of NEB having a lot of discretion and a lot of criticism against how they were interpreting the public interest, is one of the reasons why Bill 669 declared that the demise of the NEB, created the CER, and also changed the composition of the review panels and some of the directors, right? So now there's, for example, direct representation of First Nation representatives in the review panels. So when there's a discussion about what is in the public interest, there's kind of like a way to ensure that the interest of First Nations is also accounted for, right? Some would say that this is just a symbolic change. Some would say that this is kind of like a very substantive change, but it's a change nonetheless, right? So it's important to keep in mind throughout the presentation this idea of the public interest, this idea of the interpretation of what is in the public interest, because that is where a lot of the effort of stakeholders will be kind of like focused on. Now the review process and the public hearing. So usually the review process starts with kind of like a company filing an application. We will call those companies proponent or applicants. I'll use applicant throughout this presentation. And the application contains information about the design, construction, and operation of the project, but also they include information about their consultation efforts and the plans that they have for minimizing environmental impacts. And the NEB, besides evaluating these documents and this information, they launch public hearings where a variety of actors, they apply to participate. And we have, for example, in my data set, we have representatives from First Nations, trade associations, labor unions, local governments, provincial governments, all of them participating and trying to have a say in how, whether a project should be approved or not. Now, in words of the NEB, and this is kind of like really important for this project, the hearings can be used as opportunities to challenge and test the evidence of the proponent. So we can see the hearings as being arenas of contestation. So they are meant for people to go and challenge the evidence presented by the applicant. And the review process finalizes with the NEB making a decision on whether the project is in the public interest and recommends its approval to the cabinet and governor and council. When the NEB makes a decision, they usually attach to the decision a number of conditions, right? So a number of conditions that the company should fulfill before having like full approval. So why is all this interesting? Well, for me, first is we see pipeline projects going from almost like taken for granted in the early 90s to being highly controversial in recent years. We see an increase in the number of protests, an increase in the number of court cases, an increase in the number and diversity of actors contesting the projects, and how they are appealing more and more to different discourses, or what I call like value-based frames and strategies to contest the legitimacy of these projects. The second reason why this is important is, again, because legitimacy, what we consider to be legitimate and appropriate, and what we consider to be the public interest is being highly contested. And some of the ways of contesting the public interest and notions of legitimacy are based on people questioning what is of interest, what is the notion of value that inform our decision-making processes, what are we considering of worth to protect and preserve, right? And also we have some claims and arguments that focus on who is a public and who has a say in determining what is in the public interest. And ultimately, the Bill 669 in 2019 and the deinstitutionalization of the NEB is another event that makes all these process and data set like really interesting. Like something was happening throughout the years that finally made the NEB to be replaced by the CER, right? So I have here a couple of quotes from my data set that I think that represents what I'm trying to say. So we have, for example, some of the interveners of this hearing saying, so when the board says that it will consider the public interest but won't talk about climate change, which public are we talking about, right? So they are contesting at what exactly is informing and what is exactly is considered as valuable when determining the public interest. We have others that argue that, for example, so would you agree with me that indigenous knowledge based on first-hand traditional ecological knowledge is valid evidence for the purpose of understanding and addressing the impacts of the projects? So this quote took place in a case where what it was being discussed was, for example, the validity of oral evidence in the hearings and as part of the review process and as kind of like valid evidence to when determining whether a project is in the public interest or not, right? And we have some other quotes that talk about they criticize the values that inform policymaking, or they criticize who has a say in the decision-making process, right? So these are some of the quotes that support some of the arguments that I'm making about why these data set and cases are interesting. Now let's transition a little bit from the context to the literature review. Okay, so we have made an argument that pipeline projects have become highly controversial, right? And controversies usually are described in the literature as entailing plural and multipolarized debates, where a diversity of actors offer their particular points of view and rationales on how to assess or judge the legitimacy of an organization or its practices, right? And as such, they constitute scenarios where institutional arrangements are being disrupted, where multiple set of norms, values, and perceptions of legitimacy conflict, right? So we can, and kind of like many institutional theories would argue that when we talk about institutions or when we talk about legitimacy, we can talk about legitimacy in institutions from the perspective of cognitive institutions, normative institutions, and regulatory institutions. So all of these are kind of like different forms or instantiations of institutions, right? So when we have multiple set of norms, values, or perceptions of legitimacy coexisting and conflicting, we talk about plural and complex institutional environments. When there's a plurality of institutional pressures and where these different pressures are also in conflict with each other, right? And we see here a sample of different headings from news outlets talking about how controversial are these projects. So this is how we kind of like start to make a transition from the context to our literature review. And institutional plurality is defined as the presence of pressures stemming from multiple regulatory regimes, normative orders, or cultural logics. And institutional plurality has a strong quantitative flavor in the sense that when people talk about plurality, they usually talk about the number of frames that coexist or are being mobilized in a particular context. Some other people would argue that it's also related to the number of actors that are involved in a particular context. And this definition does not assume incompatibility between the multiple elements that coexist in a particular environment or setting. But those that define institutional complexity usually define it in terms of the presence of incompatible prescriptions from multiple institutional logics or frames. So complexity tends to have a more qualitative flavor in the sense that it focuses more on the quality of the relationship between these multiple elements that coexist in a particular environment or setting, right? So we have these two definitions, plurality and complexity. And in terms of complexity, I'm going to rely a lot on the work of Mia Reinert. She has a paper in 2016 where she does a very comprehensive literature review on how different researchers have used this term of institutional complexity, and she identifies 3 key dimensions of institutional complexity. So the first one is the incompatibility between these different elements that coexist in a particular setting or environment. She talks about unsettled prioritization. So you don't only have many different elements, but the people, the individuals that are part of that particular group do not have a well-recognized and agreed upon prioritization of which one should be kind of like a priority, right? So incompatibility is about many elements conflicting with each other, and settled prioritization is you have many elements and you don't know which one should be the priority. And jurisdictional overlap is the one that is more closely related to plurality in the sense that it speaks about having multiple logics or frames claiming authority over the same jurisdictional space. So for example, if we talk about pipeline projects and we look at the hearings, so I have an interesting slide here. Let me see if I have it here. So if we talk about these pipeline projects and the hearings where they are being reviewed and assessed, most of the projects between 1993 and 2001, almost everyone on those hearings were talking about market opportunities and how pipelines would be good for Canadian economy, right? So those that were talking about environmental issues or, I don't know, indigenous people's rights were almost absent in that particular period of time, right? So we could say that in those cases, we see not only low plurality, but it's really clear what was the priority for those that were making the evaluation and assessment of these projects. And it was clear that the main authority was given to frames that were related to the economic value of pipeline projects and not much to those that were talking about environment or social issues, for example, right? So some of the gaps in the literature that I'm trying to address. So the first one is in existing research, the features that differentiate institutional environments remain under theorized and also under explored empirically, right? So there's a lot of like conceptual papers talking about the different dimensions of institutional complexity, but not many empirical papers that actually tries to explore the differences between different institutional environments in terms of their complexity, for example, right? And the complexity is usually assumed by the researcher or used as background conditions. So what is Very common is if the researcher sees that there's one group of people talking about economic issues and one group of people talking about social issues, they automatically consider that as being a complex institutional environment, right? So there's usually the assumption from the researcher that we are looking at a complex institutional environment, and complexity is usually treated as a dummy variable, like whether something is complex or not complex, and not in terms of degrees of complexity. And the other problem is that we see sometimes that institutional plurality and institutional complexity are used interchangeably as if they meant the same thing, right? The other gap in the literature is that the focus tends to be on the content of institutional pressures. So again, if some people are talking about social issues and other people are talking about economic issues, we assume complexity based on the content of those claims, instead of looking at how do stakeholders or actors use those different discourses. So for example, one classic criticism is that there's a whole literature on hybrid organizations or social enterprises, right? Where we see organizations that are relatively successful in blending social and economic logics. So we see there that in spite of the fact that we see two different logics that are different in content, they are not necessarily put in considered to be incompatible for those that are kind of like using them, right? So one of the gaps, again, is that the focus tends to be more on the content of the institutional pressures rather than on how the actors are using these different logics or frames in their life, in their practice. And also most research focuses on the organizational responses rather than on the degree of effectiveness of the responses. So the focus is usually on how do organizations adapt and conform to institutional pressures. And this is very classic of institutional theories that tend to have this top-down approach. And they tend to look more at how do they adapt, conform to institutional pressures rather than on the degree of the effectiveness of their different responses. So based on that gaps, what I'm claiming to be my contributions are, first, I'm trying to integrate the notions of plurality and complexity within a same framework, but treating them as conceptually different. So they are not interchangeably, but they are non-exclusive either, right? So I propose that also that complexity does not exist beyond the actors' interactions. So I'm seeing my actors here as agentic actors, and how they interact with each other is actually the source of complexity rather than just the content of the logics that are being used. Another contribution is to be able to compare and contrast different degrees of institutional plurality and complexity and see how they may affect strategic and institutional processes. And finally, I want to make a contribution in terms of the methods and the research design of my study. So most studies talking about institutional complexity are case studies looking at using one or two cases. In my study, I'm looking at 35 cases, so I'm able to do a better job in terms of comparing and contrasting different institutional environments and how they influence differently the effectiveness of organizational responses. Also, the use of QCA and topic modeling is not something that has been widely used in research on institutional complexity or institutional plurality. I have here some other definitions of key terms that I'm using in my study. So the definition of legitimacy that is kind of like widely used in research in organizational studies is legitimacy as a generalized perception or assumption that the actions of the entity are desirable, proper, or appropriate within some socially constructed system of norms, values, beliefs, and definitions. And we see that in the cases that I'm analyzing in these hearings, what is being contested is the legitimacy, the legitimacy of the projects that are being under review. So we have the applicants defending or protecting the legitimacy of the projects, and we see the stakeholders investing significant efforts in trying to contest the legitimacy of these same projects. Another key term that I'm using is this term of frame and framing. So frames are usually defined as schemas of interpretation used by actors to locate, perceive, identify, and label a seemingly infinite number of concrete occurrences. So usually framing is defined, there are kind of like two ways of defining framing. One is more into, there's one that is more in terms of kind of like cognitive, in more a cognitive dimension, and the other one is more strategic. So one way of defining framing is the schema of interpretation, like kind of like your mindset in how you make sense of the words surrounding you, right? But also we can see frames as being strategic rhetorical devices by which one actor seeks to define a situation for another and influence their thinking and behaviors. And I'm using more the second acception of framing, like how actors in these hearings use framings to influence other on how, for example, the legitimacy of a project should be defined, right? And frames have a positive effect in terms of providing meaning, but also a negative one in terms of leaving out other possible interpretations. So when I participate in a hearing and I focus my claims and arguments on environmental issues, I'm kind of like making a claim that environmental issues should be one of the most important things to consider when judging whether a project is legitimate or not. And I leave outside other values that I consider myself probably like not as important as environmental issues, for example, right? And controversies are usually considered to be framing contests where multiple actors engage with their framings, trying to influence each other on how to define a particular issue. Okay, now let's move to the research design. So this is where things start to get a little bit complicated. And a lot of decisions have been made in this process. So my outcome, the outcome of interest is effectiveness of organizational responses. I have constructed some variables, or what QCA scholars would say conditions, related to, I have two related to plurality that are number of actors, number of value-based frames mobilized in each hearing. I have some conditions for institutional complexity, which are linked to the dimensions identified by Mia Reinert, which are unsettled prioritization, jurisdictional overlap, and incompatibility. I have some conditions related to how stakeholders perform in these hearings, like what's their repertoire diversity in the sense of how many frames they mobilize when they participate in the hearings, and which one is the most important one for them. I do the same for the applicants, and then I have one condition related to the project, which is the length of the new right-of-way needed for the project, which speaks to some degree about the level of disruption that a project may create on, the environment and local communities. So those that need more new right-of-way can be considered to be more disruptive projects, and those that have very not much new right-of-way required are probably less disruptive, least disruptive projects. This is kind of like a little bit of an overview of how I have constructed my measures. We can review, this is kind of like a lot of details, so we can review that later if there's any question, but I want you to look, so I have been using, I use a lot these terms of, like value-based frames. I talk about entropy and talk about divergence. I talk about topics throughout my presentation. So I'm going to go a little bit more in detail of what I mean when I talk about frames and value-based frames, about entropy, divergence, and topics. So I'm going to try to, and kind of like this is going to be a little bit more clear as I start to explain more about the methods that I have used. So this is the research design in terms of a sequence. So the first thing that I started to do was I did a kind of like manual content analysis to look at NEB documents and try to identify what type of projects were in my data set, how much right-of-way they were requiring, and what was a decision by the NEB, and how many conditions were imposed by the NEB for definitive approval. Then I did some pre-processing of the hearing transcripts. So it was basically cleaning the documents and reorganizing them in a way that was suited for the topic modeling. I did the topic modeling. We identified a model that had 60 topics. So 60 topics are, 60 are the topics that better represent that whole corpus of textual data that I have in my data set. I generated some complementary measures. So one was the coherence measure that tells me what is the best number of topics that better represents my whole data set. I calculated a measure for entropy, for divergence. Then we did, again, manual content analysis to be able to label each topic to assign them to what I call the value-based frame, and I'm going to explain that in a bit. We did an intercoder reliability to be sure that my coding was not too biased. So we had a second coder coding the same data set that I coded, just to be sure that there was consistency and not too many too much biases in how I was coding the different topics. Then we generated some additional measures, and then we engaged with the QCA. We did the calibration and the analysis, and now we're doing the interpretation. So about kind of like the preparing the data set. So initially what I had was 39 cases. So I had 39 projects. I had the public hearings of all these 39 projects. They're usually organized in volumes. So I'm going to show that here. So they're usually organized. So in project 1, we have volume 1, 2, and 3. And on each volume, we have different actors speaking, right? And making their claims and their justifications of whether the project should be approved or not. So what we did is we transformed this data set that was originally of 411 volumes that belonged to 35 projects. We transformed that into 3,074 new documents, each document for each actor participating on each hearing, okay? So now, before each document in my data set was a volume, now each document in my data set is one actor involved in the hearing. In total, what I have is, so that means we have like 3,074 actors involved in these 35 different projects or hearings. So in total, we have about, it's almost like 44,000 pages of data, right, that we have in this data set. So, and again, we have the time span of 1993 and 2018. With those new documents generated, we did a topic modeling using LDA model. And topic modeling is a probabilistic model that treats documents as bag of words that have been generated by a generative probabilistic model, right? And basically what it does, it uses the co-occurrence of observed words in different documents to infer topics, right? So if, let's say that we have a document where like an individual is talking about river, they say bank, they say water, salmon, and then we have another actor that says bank, finance, money, I don't know, CIBC. Automatically, this the topic modeling would identify, in spite of the fact that we have the same word in both cases, the word bank, it would identify that we are actually looking at two different topics, right? Because it can be the same word, but they co-occur in kind of like in different networks of words, right? So we have one word that talks about river, salmon, bank, that talks about an environmental issue probably. And then we have the other topic that is about bank, finances, money, and CIBC that talks about economic issues. So that's how, based on the concurrence of observed words, the topic modeling starts to identify latent topics, right? And this is considered to be an inductive approach to analyze discourse and meaning in large samples of textual data to identify latent topics and underlying patterns. And there's some work that also claims that topics could be interpreted as frames, right? Which is kind of like why I am assuming that the topics that is my output of the topic modeling can be also considered to be frames or framings. So the output of the topic modeling is usually it provides you three outputs. One is the list of topics that are better characterize the whole corpus of data, and also gives you a table that is a distribution of topics in a given document, which in my case is the distribution of topics for each given actor. So now I know actor 1, which are the main topics that are being used by actor 1, the same for actor 2, 3, 4, all the way to the 3,000 actors that I have in my hearings, in my data set. So the outputs looks a little bit like this, right? So we have on the left, the table that tells me what is the topic number in the first column, what's the weight, or which one is more important, right? The weight is kind of like a proxy for importance of these different topics. And I have the bag of words on the third column, right? And then the second output is the table or the third output, which is which I use a lot in my study, is this one that tells me the first actor whose last name is Baum, how is he using or she's using topic 0, topic 1, topic 2, topic 3. So this table tells me which actors use which topics more or less in a scale from 0 to 1. So the values that I have on each column is a value of probability. The probability of actor 1 in engaging with topic 0, topic 1, topic 2, topic 3. Okay, so that's usually how it works. Then we estimate a coherence measure, because when you do topic modeling, you usually train multiple models. So you usually train a model with, let's say, 30 topics, 35 topics, 40, and all the way to maybe 200. And this table and this kind of like measure tells you which one better represents the whole corpus without being repetitive or overlapping, right? So researchers usually use this coherence measure to choose which is the best model, which in our case was the model with 60 topics. And that is the one that we have used throughout this study. Then we do the coding. Basically, what we do is, so we know, for example, from this table, we know that the first actor, what we did was, in order to know what topic 0, what exactly was, what is the context, or what's the meaning of topic 0, what we did was, we looked for those actors that have a high probability of using topic 0. We went to the original text and we assign a label or a code to topic 0. So we basically did this, right? So for example, for topic 7, we had these words. The words were rights, nation, aboriginal, treaty, crown, Canada, etc. We looked at individuals that had a high probability of engaging with this with topic 7. We look at their original text and we assign a meaning. And this is a value-based frame that I usually talk about throughout this study. So basically, when we look at these words and we see these words in context in the quotes used by this particular individual, we can say that what is being prioritized is social issues over, for example, environmental or economic issues. And we do the same for each of the topics. So in topic 10, we have this set of words. We look at the original text of one of the actors that uses this particular topic. We look at the words in context and we assign a label. This one is mainly about environmental issues, and we do the same, and this one is mainly about economic issues. So the results of this process was, we had 4 main categories, was social, environmental, and economic. The fourth one was, there's always one category or one group of topics that we consider to be not useful because they are more about protocol. So we had a set of topics that were about, I don't know, good morning, the time of the hearing, and kind of like goodbye, some more like protocol words. So those are not talking about a specific value. So our focus is mainly on these 3 different value-based frames. And we are going to talk a little bit more about those. So let's say this individual makes a claim and a justification in the hearing. We see that in these particular quotes, we can see there's one topic that talks about rivers, oceans, and threats. We can consider that topic to be environmental. And the same individual also engages with another topic that we can consider to be more economic, right? So each individual can engage with multiple topics simultaneously. And the topics we're considering the topics as framings. And then we can group many framings into more broader categories that speak about what is being prioritized in these particular framings. And that's what we call we label those environmental, economic, and social. Okay, this one is how we calculated the entropy measures and the divergence measures. So basically, entropy speaks about, so each individual has a score for each of the 60 topics. And the sum of the 60 topics, of the probability for the 60 topics cannot be higher than 1, right? So if we see that for a particular individual, the probability is spread equally throughout the 60 topics, we say that there's high entropy. There's no prioritization. So the probability is spread equally throughout all the topics. So that's how we are estimating using the entropy measure. And there's another measure that is about divergence. And this basically estimates the distance between documents, which in my case are actors, right? So if we think about each topic as a vector, so we can have a spatial representation of the actors in a space of topics, right? So if we have that one actor is prioritizing topic 1, and another actor is prioritizing topic 60, we can say that they are very far apart. So there's very little overlap between what they are considering to be a priority in a particular setting, right? So divergence is basically how distant are these actors in the way they use these different framings, and entropy is how spread is the probability among the multiple topics. Okay, so those are, and this is a mathematical representation of this divergence. Okay, so let's jump to the results. The research design is a little bit messy and complicated, so the results probably would be a little bit more interesting. So the first thing that we did was estimating, plurality and complexity, and then we positioned all the projects based on their score of plurality and complexity. And I don't know if you see that those that have high plurality and high complexity are projects that we kind of like knew that were going to be really problematic cases. So we have kind of like in the in this corner, we have Trans Mountain Expansion project, we have Energy East project, and we have Northern Gateway Pipeline. Then we have line 3 here as a project that has high plurality and not much complexity, and there's a reason for that. So line 3 was a very controversial project, but a lot of the hearing was focused specifically on issues about indigenous people's rights, for example, right? So that's why we have high plurality in the sense that there were many actors involved, but not as high in complexity because most of the discussion was focused on one particular set of issues, right, related to First Nations rights and well-being. We have also like a Keystone pipeline project here. So while this can be a little bit obvious, what I like about this representation is that finally the methodology and all the measures kind of like make sense. So we can say that the approach kind of has some face validity in the sense that it helps us to, through a more maybe objective process and analysis, come up with a conclusion that we usually arrive through, I don't know, intuition, right? So that's kind of like one of the first things that I wanted to share with you. And then we have a set of other projects that are kind of like lower in plurality and complexity that are more in the bottom left, okay? And these are the results of the QCA, okay? So some of the findings, some of the preliminary findings, and this is kind of like where I would like to hear your comments in terms of, I don't know, does this story make sense? Do you think that maybe I should be doing something different, or maybe the consistency or coverage values are not good enough to make a claim about, to make some particular claims that I'm making? So that would be very helpful if I can hear from you. So I ran 4 models. 2 models were trying to look at what are the conditions that better explain low effectiveness in organizational responses to complexity and plurality. And 2 models were to find out that what it better explains the high effectiveness of organizational responses. So in terms of low effectiveness, we of course see a set of projects that we already knew that were going to be here. So we have Trans Mountain Expansion project, pipeline, Northern Gateway, we have Energy East, and we have Line 3 replacement program. So those are kind of like projects that have shown to low effectiveness in dealing with plurality and complexity. And we can make that claim based on the number of conditions that have been imposed to these projects. So for example, Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline, it was a project that was brought to courts. It had to be bought by the federal government, and it got 157 conditions, with an average where the average in the whole data set, in the whole sample, was around 30, 35 conditions, right? So that one has 157. Northern Gateway Pipeline got 209 conditions. It was also brought to courts and ultimately it was canceled. Energy East is a project where the company withdrew their application because the project became too controversial, right? And then we have Line 3 replacement program that had 89 conditions and also was brought to courts, but in the US, not in Canada. What is interesting, so all these 4 projects are represented in the solution 2.1b, right? Where we see all dimensions of plurality and complexity are high, right? Which is what kind of like better explains why the company had a very hard time to be able to be effective in how they dealt with a particular situation. What for me was surprising was solution 1A. So Express Pipeline project is an old pipeline project, old in my data set. So it was a review process that took place in 1996. This project does not have a high number of conditions, so it only had 39 conditions. What was surprising to me is that when I saw these results and I went back to the case, that project is the only one in my whole data set where one panel member disagreed with a decision of approving the pipeline, right? Now, for me, what is interesting is that that piece of information is not used in the analysis, but somehow that particular configuration resulted as being meaningful for low effectiveness. And delving a little bit deeper in that particular case, I was able to find that that particular case have a dissent among the panel members that were in charge of, responsible of reviewing and approving the project. So we could argue that these configurations for low effectiveness, so in terms of the interpretation of the findings, is that we see that there's no contradiction. So the configurations that better explain low effectiveness, we don't see the same configuration in the projects that had high effectiveness, which means that that particular configuration definitely helps us to explain low effectiveness, right? There's no contradiction in that. We see that when all conditions of plurality and complexity are high, with emphasis on number of factors, incompatibility, and jurisdictional overlap, we see that there's low effectiveness. And we also see that there's an important role played by the degree of how disruptive is the project in terms of the length of the new right-of-way required by the project. When we look at the configurations for high effectiveness, we see that there's equifinality. So there are like many different ways in which companies can be effective in dealing with complexity and plurality and different degrees of complexity and plurality. We see that when all or most conditions are low, despite the project being highly disruptive, we see that companies can be effective in dealing with and in being effective, right? So we see that still when there's when we're talking about disruptive projects, is still if we have low plurality and low complexity, companies are more successful in dealing with these different pressures. When there's low plurality, incompatibility is not critical, probably because when we have very few actors involved in the controversy, but between them, it's we have high complexity. Because we have just a few number of actors, it's probably easier to arrive to compromise or to arrive to agreements with them rather than having a lot of complexity, but complexity that is involving a large number of actors, right? So that's probably one possible interpretation that we can have there. And finally, solution 6 is interesting. It only has one case explained by that particular configuration. And it's interesting because, and that's a very particular case, that's the case of the Line 9 reversal project. And it was not a new pipeline, but it was a case where they were trying to reverse the flow of oil. I don't remember if it was from Alberta to East Coast or from East Coast to Alberta. So it was not about a new pipeline, so it was a non-disruptive project. But there was a lot of controversy because the approval of the project would represent whether you would rely more on imports of oil or you would incentivize more the production of domestic oil. So that was kind of like part of the controversy. And that's why probably that case was very special and had its own configuration here. So in this model, what I was trying to look at was specifically the different dimensions of plurality and complexity. And on the second models, what I was trying to look at is overall plurality and complexity and looking more specifically at how the applicant or the organizations were responding to complexity and plurality. So the findings here were that, of course, those that have low effectiveness were the same 4 projects that we have already discussed in the previous slide. And low effectiveness, we see that there's, again, no contradiction. So no contradiction, right? So we don't see the same configuration for low effectiveness. We don't see that same configuration in high effectiveness, of course. We see that when applicants respond to plurality by mobilizing multiple topics, like using generalists rather than specialists, they usually have low effectiveness. So when there's a lot of pressure and multiple pressures from multiple actors mobilizing multiple framings, if they engage in that particular situation with individuals that mobilize also multiple framings simultaneously, they tend to be less effective than if they engage with specialists, like a number of different, let's say, experts that are each of them focused on a particular issue, right? So engaging with generalists when dealing with complexity tends to be counterproductive. The only case, again, in terms of low effectiveness, we see that the only case in, for example, in S1, where there is no gap in responding to stakeholders' value-based frame is L3P, Line 3 replacement program, which is the one that I already explained, that it was a case where most of the actors involved were focusing specifically on indigenous people's rights and issues, right? So in that case, so that's from the 4 cases that have low effectiveness, that one is the only one that is a little bit distinct from the other 3, because that's the only one where most of the issues were focused on indigenous people's rights rather than a broad array of different topics and framings. And again, we see an important role played by the length of right-of-way here. Finally, in terms of high effectiveness, we see again equifinality. So there are many paths leading to high effectiveness. When plurality and complexity are low and actors are focused on specific topics, we see again high effectiveness, right? When plurality is low and complexity is high, so when there are like a few actors and value frames, but multiple framings and topics, applicants can afford to engage with the generalists, right? So this is kind of like different. So when you have high complexity and high plurality, you should engage with specialists. But when you have low plurality and high complexity, you can afford to engage with generalists because they're like a more narrow set of individuals that you have to deal with and negotiate, probably, right? When plurality and complexity is high, applicants should address stakeholders' concerned with specialists rather than generalists, which is the argument I have made before. When plurality and complexity is high, applicants can afford not addressing stakeholder concerns when the project is non-disruptive. So we see that projects that are non-disruptive, but still we see some degree of plurality and complexity and a gap between how applicants are responding to the concern of stakeholders, we still see that they manage to be effective, right? And it's probably because we're talking about projects that are least disruptive. So maybe regulators do not provide a lot of importance to the claim of the different stakeholders. And also those that are high in effectiveness are projects that can be highly disruptive, but have low plurality and low complexity. And kind of like overall, these results gives us a little bit of a picture of how different degrees of combination of plurality and complexity can have different effects on the effectiveness of the organizational responses. So this is the last slide. I know that the interpretation of the findings is still a little bit messy, and this is kind of like this is the stage where I'm trying to kind of like working on right now. So any feedback on that would be really helpful. And I have here again that some of the contributions that I'm trying to make, integrating plurality and complexity in the same framework, comparing and contrasting different degrees of plurality and complexity, and see how they can affect different strategic and institutional processes, and bring this new method in this new kind of like set of methods to be able to better study, understand, and interpret different strategic and institutional processes in complex and plural institutional environments. So that's it. Thank you very much. Hope you find it interesting, and I'm really looking forward to hear your comments and feedback.
Thank you very much, Juan Francisco. You not only study complexity, but your research design is quite complex, and you definitely have a a very deep sense of how to approach this, and my compliments on your data set. And I think it's highly promising, what you can do with it. And thanks. I don't think it was messy what you described, but I think it's highly promising in terms of the material that you've gathered and your particular focus on how to analyze it. But let me open this up to others who might want to ask a question. Anyone who wants to lead us on? Mehdi.
Hi, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. It's a bit far away from what I'm doing, but in terms of method, I found it quite relevant to my work. And sorry, I'm not turning my camera on because I think my connection is not that stable. I have a question about your coding, and this is for my own research mostly. I noticed that you selected several keywords for each of the topics that you selected. I was wondering how did you come up with those specific words? Because as a person with English as a second language for myself, I found it really challenging to come up with those words. I was wondering if you have any suggestions or if there is a source that you could I should use. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. So I think you're referring to, so I have this table where there's like a topic number and there's like a list of words, right? And that's the output of the topic modeling, which is an automated way of doing content analysis, right? So this is not something that I have chosen, but it's the output of the topic modeling. That is, the topic modeling identifies this set of words because the set of words tend to co-occur together in the different documents that are being analyzed, right? So for example, if we have one of the topics that is the set of words that are being selected is, I don't know, as I mentioned, river, bank, salmon, fishing, is because throughout the 3,000 documents, there's some consistency of this set of words as co-occurring together in these documents, right? So those words, I have not chosen them. They are the output of this automated content analysis technique, right? And this is usually used to kind of like give you an idea of what are the latent topics and patterns in large samples, kind of like large data sets of textual data, right? But kind of like these bags of words is usually referred to as bags of words, right? So you have this set of words that are put together in a bag that kind of like are assigned a topic number. Those words mean nothing if you don't put a little bit kind of like the effort of trying to interpret them. So the exercise that I did was I look at the topic, the set of words, and I said, okay, which actors uses a lot this topic, has a high probability of engaging with this topic. I went to the original transcript of this individual actor to be able to see this set of 20 words, to see them in context, right? So I started to look for fragments in the original text where many of these words were appearing together. And I read those fragments. And based on that, I said, okay, this topic is about environmental issues. This other topic is more focused on prioritizing social issues. And this other topic is prioritizing so it was economic, environmental, and social, right? So the argument there is what I'm trying to see is by mobilizing these different topics, what is this actors trying to say in regard, what are the values that should inform the decision-making process of what is in the public interest, right? So the manual interpretative phase is basically assigning a label to these keywords that were the output of the topic modeling, which is an automated process. So I don't know if that's address the question.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you, Mehdi.
Okay, so Rod is next. Or was it? Yeah, Rod and then Nicole. Rod, if you unmute yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, it's a fascinating presentation. Very, very interesting, massively challenging. It'd take a long time to sort through exactly what you've said. But I have two rather less complex questions. One is your choice of an indicator of effectiveness. You're using the number of conditions imposed by the NEB decision. And one could wonder about that. I mean, any one condition could turn out to be a deal breaker. I mean, you might have one condition as opposed to 17, but the one matters. So effectiveness, I wonder if one couldn't somehow also look to some measure of the degree to which the decision could be characterized as acceptable or legitimate. And did did the decision really cripple the applicant's hopes, or did the package of conditions cripple the applicant's hopes in some way, or render it more acceptable to the public? So that's one question. The second question is your chart showing plurality as against complexity. It wasn't exactly a 45-degree line, but it was, if you looked at the chart, it's sort of trending upwards. If it were a 45-degree line, then I guess you could say plurality and complexity are more or less the same thing. Don't distinguish. Now you actually seem to be getting significant results out of the difference between plurality and complexity in your final chart. So I just thought it was interesting that there's a big overlap between those two notions, but where there's not overlap, there seems to be some significance to the difference. So I just thought that was worth a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Rod. Definitely. So in regard to the second question or the second comment, I would say that even like conceptually, there's some overlap. So we cannot think about complexity if we don't have certain degree of plurality, right? So you need certain elements to exist to be able to actually say that there's some degree of incompatibility between them, right? So I definitely agree that there is probably some degree of correlation between these two variables, right? But we see also some cases like the line 3 replacement program, right? Where we see that there's high complexity, but not so high plurality. And still that project was kind of like problematic, right? In terms of like the number of conditions and what happened after. So that's something that I should do. And kind of like, even if we go to, there's one kind of like seminal paper of institutional complexity by an author called Greenwood, and he has this figure where he have a kind of like a more like a process model, and he has first institutional plurality, and then you have institutional complexity, right? Like complexity builds on plurality to some degree, right? So as you say, definitely there is probably some degree of overlap. I'll try to estimate some correlations to see maybe how big of a correlation we find there, and also try to report on that. I think that would be maybe helpful as well. So that's in regard to the second comment. And on the first one, so the issue of effectiveness was kind of like a big discussion, like with my supervisor, myself, like trying to come up with a kind of like a good outcome variable. And I think that, for example, all of the projects that I have in my sample were approved with except for Energy East project that was withdrawn by the applicant, right? As far as I know, all the projects were successful except for those that have high number of conditions, like for example, Trans Mountain and Northern Gateway Pipeline projects kind of like failed, were partially failed in the case of Trans Mountain because it was bought and it's still the government's trying to move it forward. But those coincidentally are the ones that had the highest number of conditions, right? Above 150 and 209 conditions. So I agree that there are some conditions that are more difficult for the company than others. So I agree with that. I'm wondering if maybe one alternative could be to having the number of conditions and maybe assigning a weight to each condition, and then maybe generating an aggregate that would say that overall the score in terms of, I don't know, effectiveness, accounts for number and weight, right? So maybe that could be an alternative, but that's a really good point, Rod. Thanks.
Wouldn't you say that Trans Mountain, for example, has continued to be really controversial, and in some sense it's stalled, but it's not stalled because of the number of conditions. It's stalled because it hasn't persuaded the community of any kind of social license.
Yeah.
In a sense, the problem, well, I guess in neither of the cases was the problem actually created for the proponent because of the number of conditions. It was just the lack of a sales pitch.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Now the argument there, kind of like in this study, when I talk about effectiveness, I'm talking about the effectiveness in defending the legitimacy of the project, right? So I'm not talking much about the effectiveness of the project itself, but how effective were the applicants in protecting the legitimacy of the project. One assumption that I have is if the NEB launches a hearing and no one participates, probably the project will be approved with 0 conditions, right? So I'm making an assumption that maybe the stakeholders are being more effective in challenging the project, the number of conditions is going to increase, right? That can still mean that you can have a high number of conditions and the project as a project can still succeed and be really effective in succeeding, right? But in terms of that specific setting of the hearing, if we see that the applicant is failing in defending the legitimacy of the project, I would assume, and this is an assumption that I make, and it's probably part of the limitations of the study as well, right? That I'm assuming that if the applicant fails to protect the legitimacy of the project in that particular hearing, the number of conditions will start to increase. But it's a limitation. It's not a perfect measure, right? But yeah.
You have to have something. Thank you very much.
Rod. And well, Francisco, you already answered the question that I probably don't have time to raise anymore, which was about how you define and effectiveness and what exactly it is that you try to get at. So we have Nicole and Amy on the list. Nicole, you're next.
Great, thanks, Oliver. Thanks, Juan Francisco. That was great. It makes me appreciate how much more complex your project is than you ever let on when we chat on Thursdays. I have 2 questions. One of them kind of relates to Rod's and one of them relates to Mehdi's. And the first one, as I'm also like coding and looking for framing and things like that, I wonder when I saw the kind of flow from topic number to the words, to the cluster words, to going back to the original quote, and then the value-based frame, it made me wonder to what degree is the value-based frame predetermined because of the words that are assigned to the topic, or if there's a way in which you can mitigate against kind of a predetermination. Because when I looked at the word cluster, it was obvious, like to me, it looked obvious that environment was going to come out. So that was my first question. And then my second question was, and we talked about this a bit last week, but it has to do with that other condition on project where you did the right of way, the distance of the right of way or whatever. And I guess this kind of like maps onto Rod's question in terms of effectiveness just being number of conditions versus a more quality dimension to it. So I like the idea of the weighting, but I was thinking that should there be another kind of project factor or condition in this first sense, in terms of like the quality of the land or some element of the type of land that the pipelines are running through, because I'm wondering if, the number of indigenous communities or the sustainability or vulnerability or kind of like the ecological sensitivity of the land has a correlation to specific conditions or things like that. So I was thinking, why did you just do the one project condition on the right-of-way size?
Yeah, I agree. There are like a lot of variables that can also help explain the outcome variable that I have, right? For example, issues of power, or like not only how many communities are on the kind of like path of the pipeline, but also how many resources these communities control, right? That can also like influence whether some actors are giving more credibility and weight in the hearing compared to others. So on this kind of like project, I was trying to focus more specifically on language, and I use this measure of length of right of way initially more as a control variable rather than something that I really wanted to explore further. But it ended up being like a really important one, right? Because kind of like having a kind of like long, kind of like new required right of way influences a lot of how many actors will participate in the hearing, right? If you have many communities, your plurality score more likely will increase. You have more communities that are wanting to participate in the hearing. But there were a couple of solutions in the QCA that had high right-of-way, but low plurality and complexity, right? So it's definitely an important variable, but it's not necessarily explaining completely the outcome, right? I think if I want to have like a more complete picture of what's going on, I should definitely include issues like whether the company has had spills in the past, right? Also some information about the project related, as you say, whether the land where it's crossing is more, I don't know, like valuable for policymakers or community, etc. That could help explain more. But I guess my main argument would be, in terms of the scope of this research being more about language, I would just stick to just one control, but definitely something that I completely agree that there are other variables of the communities and the land that could help better explain what's going on, right? So for example, in the 2 other studies of my dissertation, I'm taking an approach where I'm trying to factor in more conditions to better explain the outcomes. But on this one, I'm kind of like sticking with language, but yeah, thank you.
I like that this is just one part of the dissertation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I didn't answer the first one though.
Oh yeah, no, about the topic, the keywords kind of predetermining the value frame.
So definitely the keywords, we can also already start to infer what is the value that is behind that particular set of words, right? In some cases, it's very clear, right? I still went to the original documents just to be sure. I felt that it was a more rigorous process, but I've seen a lot of papers published using topic modeling that they do the interpretation just with that set of words. Yeah. But it's always the researcher that has to make the decision of how are you going to assign meaning to that topic, just by looking at the words or going to the original documents and try to see the words in context. So in some cases, it was necessary to go to the original documents to have a better idea of what was the value that was behind that particular frame. In others, as you say, was kind of like very easy. And I have chosen the easiest ones to show here because it was kind of like clearer for everyone to understand how the process looked, but some others were a little bit more challenging. I hope that answers.
Amy, did you want to jump in next? And then we'll do Keith, and we've got about 6 minutes to wrap everything together.
Yeah, JF, I just wanted to say this is hugely impressive, and I hope the other 2 papers are less work. I feel like you've done enough work for this to be an entire dissertation. Just quickly on the right-of-way, I agree. I mean, I use it in my QCA for oil pipelines, so I'm a little bit biased. I think it is a good measurement. I mean, it's crude, pardon the pun, but it gets at this really important dimension that if you have a long right-of-way, there's going to be more communities involved. And looking at, it's hard to do, I think, conditions for this, but yeah, that you could get really nitty gritty in terms of like density of populations, but then you also have, you know, smaller municipalities that are equally as opposed to a particular project. You could look at number of indigenous communities. Those are generally correlated with right-of-way, although not exactly. So yeah, I think it's very defensible for this type of the project or this part of the project. But my questions, I have a lot of them and I need more time to digest some of the findings, but one is on endogeneity and the scope of the issues that the NEB right determines. And so over time, and I'm sure you know this, the scope of issues that are included in the hearings have increased, you know, fairly consistency because of the demand, right? Stakeholders are asking for more issues. So does the number of conditions correlate? You know, it probably correlates very strongly with the number of condition or the number of issues that are allowed to be discussed in the NEB hearing. And then the second issue or question I had is around land rights and these social issues and the interesting case of the Line 3 replacement, because a lot of the concerns around land issues are brought up on the NEB, but the NEB can't really do much about them. And as a result, they don't really appear in the conditions for a project. So it would be interesting, and don't do this for this project, it's too much work, but to code the conditions in terms of environmental, social, and economic, and to see how that lines up with what's brought up in the hearing. That would be really interesting for a different project. And then the last question is on compatibility and around, I think this is a really interesting distinction, because you can have actors disputing, the economic benefits of the project. I mean, those are incompatibilities, but not how you define incompatibility or a complexity, if I have that right. So that's an interesting finding, and I think maybe worth unpacking a little bit in the discussion. Yeah, I'd like to hear more about that.
Maybe what we could do, Juan Francisco, is just let Keith jump in with his question, and you can decide which ones to answer and how to comment. Keith, do you want to pop in?
Sure, yeah. First, just let me say thanks for a great presentation, and also to foreground that this is wildly outside of my area of expertise, so I don't understand the presentation quite as well as some of the other people, but I'll try to engage from the place that I'm able to. And I wanted to kind of pick up on Rod's question a little bit about the use of the number of conditions as kind of an indicator of how successful the process was in dealing with complexity. And it strikes me like, in the case of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, for example, there were a high number of conditions, but I think if you talk to the people raising concerns, they would say none of those conditions speak adequately to the concerns they raised. So I got myself wondering, can we say that a high number of conditions signals successfully dealing with complexity if those conditions don't speak to the complex concerns that were raised? And likewise, I guess I was wondering, like you note that the projects were in every single case approved. And so is this a relevant indicator as well to how successful the process is in dealing with complexity if it always leads to the same process without it, or to the same result without exception?
Yeah, I think, thank you both for the questions. A lot to think about. So I think that your comment, Keith, links to what Amy was saying about maybe coding the conditions based on. So for example, if we see that stakeholders were really prioritizing environmental issues, and we see that most of the conditions imposed by the NEB are economic, we see that there's a problem, right? And that definitely can help kind of like enrich the discussion. So that's something that I'll try to do, that definitely could help. But what I wanted to point out about the issue of effectiveness is, so I'm not making a claim about the process being effective, because if we see that almost all the projects have been approved, I don't know how effective the process is, to be honest, right? So I don't think that the NEB, and that's probably one of the reasons why the NEB was kind of like replaced by the CER, is because a lot of people were actually criticizing the NEB because it's kind of like, doesn't make sense that 100% of the projects that are under review get approved, right? So I would not say that it's really effective, the process, but I would see that sometimes companies can do, this is kind of like a tricky claim, right? And I'm not very happy of saying it, but I would say that we could make an argument that, or we can flip the argument. We can make an argument that if we see more conditions imposed by the NEB, it probably means that the stakeholders have been more successful, at least on creating some degree of instability for the project, right? Because at least having a lot of conditions for a project for public opinion means that the project was being highly contested, right? So my argument of effectiveness is more in terms of how effective was the company on trying to defend the project from these, from the critiques from the stakeholders, right? That can be flipped as well to say how effective were stakeholders in attacking or kind of like contesting the legitimacy of the project. So I just kind of like, I think I have to be a little bit more clear about what exactly do I mean for effectiveness, because I understand that when I say effectiveness, some people will think about, oh, the effectiveness of the project or the effectiveness of the process, right? But I'm just talking about, because the focus is on the use of language, how apparently the company managed to address most of the concerns of stakeholders. If they didn't manage to address the concerns, my assumption is it's more likely that would result in a condition imposed by the NEB, right? So the NEB would never say, we're going to reject the project. we'll say, okay, let's put another condition to the list and maybe reach, I don't know, 500 conditions, right? So that's, but that's still, if you have more conditions, that still tells something. And for me, it tells that there were many issues that were left unresolved, right? That the company was not probably successful in addressing or resolving. But that's an assumption, but definitely that's one of the weaknesses probably, right, of the study to better explain that part.
Well, Juan Francisco, we'll probably have to stop there, but I wanted to really thank you for sharing your research in motion. And now I have a really good sense of this. I also want to applaud you for your multi-case design and taking on such a huge project. And I think that really does speak to the fact that you're trying to get at the heart of the issue and find the evidence there. So really appreciate that. Thank you very, very much for being such a great member of our community.
Thank you, Jody.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for being here. It's been a great experience. This is the first time I present this study, so great practice.